Hello guys and gals, and welcome. Welcome. So today we're going to be doing kind of like a tutorial video. What I want to talk about today is I want to talk about, well, like how do you apply ailments? And this is all of them. So ignite, freeze, bleed, poison, what am I missing? Stun, pin, shock, electrocution. Is there any other that I'm missing? There's probably something else I'm missing. I'll just write etc. Now, a lot of people get confused about this because it's not always easy to apply them. You might be using a character, and the character might have an ability that freezes targets, and it doesn't seem to be freezing anything. Or you might have an ability that says that it stuns targets, and it doesn't seem to be stunning anything. And the moral of the story with this is actually a lot simpler than a lot of people realize, and it's essentially that Path of Exile 2 follows a pretty simple formula when it comes to freezing, pinning, bleeding, igniting, shocking, whatever targets. And it has to do with magnitude of the original hit, right? And to put this into layman's terms, the bigger the hit, the better the ailment, right? And this goes across the board for everything. Damage. Damage is one of the most important things when it comes to igniting, freezing, bleeding, poisoning, stunning, pinning, shocking, electrocuting. It doesn't matter. It's not as complicated as people try to make it. Like, when you look at it from a certain perspective, it seems complicated. Okay, it seems complicated, but the moral of the story is that if you're trying to freeze a target, you need damage, right? You need damage. What does damage represent in this particular equation? Well, it represents the base of the freeze, right? Let's use freeze as our example because freeze is one of the things that people really like to do. So it's the base of the freeze, right? If you were, like building damage for your skill, and you had a bunch of plus percentages, like you had 300% increased damage or 500% increased damage or 1,000% increased damage. If you were using a low level gem, like a level, like 10 gem or something, or a level 14 gem, and you're like a level 99 character, you wouldn't really be getting very much damage out of it, would you? Because the base of the skill is low. Which is one of the things that I'm going to tell you right now is that a lot of these things on the board that give you, for instance, freeze buildup. So 20% increased freeze buildup with empowered attacks. 20% increased freeze buildup. This is a bonus to the base, right? This is not an effect that's actually going to give you like freezing power. It's a multiplier essentially, or a increase of the base number, right? So when you're trying to freeze something, the most important number that you can come across is the base of the freeze, because that is the damage that everything else is multiplying. So if you add freeze multipliers, if your ability has freeze multipliers, so like if we take a look at Fangs of the Frost, Fangs of the Frost has a multiplier on it of 380% more magnitude of chill inflicted, 300% more freeze buildup, right? These bonuses are to the base. And if your base sucks, then you're going to get nowhere. And that's why these abilities like Fangs of the Frost tend to do nothing. Because you're not scaling your damage properly. And a lot of the times people will run into this problem. They'll run into a problem where they're trying to cause a freeze, or they're trying to cause like a really good bleed, or they're trying to cause a really good ignite or stun or whatever, but they're not considering the fact that you need damage. Scaling your damage, and I'm going to write this. So number one, scaling your damage is the best way to apply any ailment, bar none. That is the best method that you can apply. The second way after that, of course, is to scale your damage. And you might be wondering why I'm putting this in a second place. Well, this is penetration and exposure. Okay, so penetration and exposure are both ways that you can increase your damage that don't apply to you, but apply to the monster. Because it's not you that matters in this particular situation. It's the monster that matters. It's how much damage am I doing to the monster. And if the monster has resistances to your cold damage, or has resistances to your physical damage, or has resistances to your ignite damage, or whatever, then that means that you're going to be doing less damage to the target, which means less buildup of the freeze. Okay? And penetration and exposure are both ways that you can increase damage taken. Right? And this is very important for the overall effectiveness of your freezing. Another way is, of course, to build, like, I'll just type in Immobilization, or just, we'll just type in Ailment. Ailment Buildup, right? So Ailment Buildup is like a multiplier for your damage after the fact, right? So if I have, a player, and my player is doing, say, like 100,000 damage, and then I have like 400% more freeze buildup, right? Well, that means that I'm going to get a large amount of additional freeze buildup for that 100,000 damage, as if it was like 400,000 damage instead. And if I only had 10,000 damage instead, then that would only be 40,000 instead of 10,000. And you can see where that 400% more is super beautiful. It's a very beautiful thing. It's very beautiful. But if your damage sucks, you're not going to get any freezes. Okay? Now, this causes a problem. So what is the problem? Problemo. The problemo is basically this. As you scale your damage, the monster will gain the ailment. Okay? But is likely to die. Because it's usually a factor of versus the monster's HP, right? So if the monster has a specific amount of HP, let's pretend the monster has 100,000 damage HP, right? And you hit that target with an attack that does, say, 75,000 damage, then they are likely going to freeze. But they are also going to be at 1/4 health in the process, right? So their health is now going to be much lower than normal. And in my experience, the main problem with ailments is not necessarily applying them. It's usually applying them in a way that leaves the monster alive so that you can actually take advantage of said application, which is annoying, to say the least. And I'll kind of like give you an idea of what this looks like. So let me go with my character. This is a freeze character, and I'm going to show you how I can pretty much freeze any target that I want to. So boom, boom, right? They froze, right? They were frozen. But what happens? They're dead, right? So freezing a target is easy, but it's not always necessarily like the best way. I'm going to go ahead and apply my Frost Bomb to apply exposure. And as you can see, I can freeze the target in essentially one hit. Frost Bomb is a good way to apply exposure. I have lots of penetration for cold damage, and of course, I can apply freezes relatively quickly. There's another problem, though. So even if you're really good at applying your freezes, even if you have your exposure, even if you have good damage, you're going to run into another issue with immobilizations, not necessarily the ignites, the poisons and stuff, but you're going to run into a problem which is... it's like a cooldown period, or I'm trying to think exactly how to put it. Monsters have like freeze or immobilization protection, right? Immobilization protection. So if they've recently been frozen, right, then you're going to have a hard time building a freeze on them at a second time until that protection goes away, which is usually a couple seconds. So you can't really like refreeze and chain freeze a target over and over and over again. If you try, what's going to happen is it's only going to do like a little bit of buildup. And I can show you this as well too. So let's go to a target and I'll show you how the immobilization protection kicks in and how it prevents the targets from being frozen a second time. So I got to find somebody that's actually got some HP here. Avoid clicking on that. Okay, here we go. We've got a target. So let me go ahead and freeze this guy. And of course I killed him instantaneously. This is the problem that I've noticed. And this is what I was just talking about. Is that a lot of the times in the process of freezing a target, when you get enough damage, the targets will die. Almost guaranteed, like every single time. The targets will die as a result of doing enough damage to freeze them. It's currently something that I really don't like about the way that the immobilization system works, is that the closer you get to being a very effective immobilizer, stunning, freezing, pinning, etc., the closer you get to applying those things on a regular basis with every single time you strike, the closer you are to basically just one-shotting everything, which I'm currently at. My damage is pretty ridiculous with Fangs of the Frost at this point. It's kind of redonkulous. I do like 68,000 damage per explosion. I get like anywhere between like 10 to 20 explosions. I get a huge multiplier on those explosions of 118%, even more multipliers. Like by the time I'm done, I think I do like 5 or 6 million damage per like explosion cycle, which is only like a couple seconds. It's not even really that difficult to do either. And Fangs of Frost is an ability that's designed to freeze things, but most of the time it doesn't freeze anything. It just explodes them. So going back into this, let's talk about some of the non-immobilization skills. So I also talked about Poison, Ignite, Bleed, and of course there's also... what did I leave off of here? I've got Ignite, I've got Bleed, I've got Poison. I'm missing one. I don't know. But these are damage over times, right? So how does damage over time calculate its damage? Well, the same way. It's the same way. The higher damage your initial hit, the better the damage is going to be when it hits the target. And the higher damage your initial hit, the more likely it is that the monster is going to die before the ticking actually takes place. There's some really good items in the game that kind of help with this stuff. So let's talk about really quickly like the damage types, right? So cold damage obviously is freeze. When you're talking about poison, it's mainly physical damage. And then of course we also have bleed, which is also physical damage. And you might be saying, but Ginger, poison is chaos damage, right? Poison is chaos, but not the thing that triggers it. And this is kind of important for you to understand, is that if you want to trigger the poison, you have to trigger the poison with the thing that triggers it. And physical damage is generally the thing that triggers poison. Now, there are some really good unique items in the game. There's actually a nice pair of gloves that you can get relatively early. It's called Snakebite. No, not that one. That's the one that gives you more +1 poisons, but that's not the one I'm looking for. I think I have it in here. I do not have it in here. It's the one that applies poisons. Magnitude on all damage types. I just realized this is set to equipable. Although it should be equipable no matter what. The easiest way would just be to pull them up on PoE2DB instead of floundering about like a silly person. And they are Plague Fingers. That's right, Plague Fingers. All damage from hits contributes to poison magnitude. Now, things like this will make it so that all damage type contributes to poison magnitude and so forth and so on. Which means that you can use poison, you can use lightning, you can use whatever you want to, right? But you have to be wearing the gloves, which is actually pretty massive because in this particular case, since your magnitude is decided by the strength of the hit, being able to apply the entirety of all of your damage types to the magnitude is massive. It is a massive way to do things. There's a couple items in the game that can allow you to do stuff like this. Like, for instance, there is a bow character. I believe it's this one. Besides, of course, the poison gloves. There's also a bow that allows you to do this. It is the Periphery bow, which elemental damage from hits contributes to flammability, ignite, chill magnitudes, freeze buildup, and shock chance, right? So this allows you to basically freeze targets with fire damage or lightning damage, which is pretty crazy. Overall, when you're talking about the magnitudes of a effect, even if it's a bleed or a freeze or a pin, is any, I think. I don't remember if pin has a specific type. I think there's a couple different ways that you can potentially pin. There's some boots, I think, that give you like all damage is pinning and so forth and so on. Pinning is something that you kind of have to add into your character, if I remember correctly, not something that you get for free. But like, for instance, there is the bushwhack boots, which makes it so that physical damage is pinning specifically, and you can generate pinning in various ways. You can also stun. Stun is physical damage. So physical damage is stun. And a lot of these work well. Now, there are some ways that you can bypass the normal restrictions, right? So this is something that we'll have to talk about as a second thing, which is known as primed for X. Primed for stun, primed for freeze, primed for etc., right? These usually come along with specific abilities. Like, for instance, if you look at abilities like... right off the top of my head, I know for a fact that Arctic Howl has primed for on it. So if you look at Arctic Howl, it says shapeshift into werewolf and let out an icy howl that damages enemies and freezes primed enemies. Normal enemies are primed for freeze when they have at least 40% freeze buildup. Magic enemies are instead primed at 50% buildup, and rare enemies are at 60%, and unique enemies are at 70%. So for instance, with this particular ability, if you utilize it, you can freeze a monster who is not at 100% freeze, which can allow you, if your magnitude is low, to be able to still freeze a target before the target dies by essentially exploiting the fact that they have reached the threshold for prime to freeze. There's also primed to stun and various other things that you can utilize like this, and it usually has an icon above the monster's head specifically indicating that they are ready for the prime to freeze, so that you know that they have reached that threshold. Now, you can't see the primed for freeze, primed for stun threshold icon unless you have one of these abilities on your bar, right? So you have to have a primed for ability on your bar to be able to use it. Staggering Palm is primed for stun. I believe there's also Seismic Cry is primed for stun. Then we also have Arctic Howl, which is, of course, primed for freeze. Wing Blast is apparently primed for heavy stun, which is really good. And so forth and so on, right? So being able to allow, like, the primed for is a way that you can essentially bypass the normal restrictions, right? So if a monster requires 100% freeze to freeze, you can cause this to happen quicker by using the primed for stun, right? So like at 50%, you can essentially use the Arctic Howl ability and you can freeze them instantaneously, which can allow you to freeze targets with lesser damage abilities. And then we're going to talk about freeze threshold, right? So I talked about freeze threshold a little bit, or ailment buildup. So ailment buildup is a multiplier, essentially, or multiplier or additive bonus that applies to the base, right? So we talked about that a little bit when we were talking about like 400% more freeze buildup, right? Well, there's not just more, there's also increased, and you can see those all over the board. There's some pretty good ones, like when you're looking around, you're going to find like freeze buildup. Freeze buildup is all over the board. You can get it over here, you can get it over here, and so forth and so on. There's also just immobilization. I don't even know if I spelled that right. I know for a fact there's an immobilization node right. Where are you hiding at? It's one of the companion nodes. I distinctly remember taking it because it was really good. It's a really good companion node. Let me just type in companion and then I can find the companion node. There it is. Scum. Scum is a really interesting one and it has immobilized on it, right? So here we go. So let's type in immobilized. Immobilized. And then we have any node that has immobilized on it. I'm sure. Immobilized, not boil. There we go. So this one gives you 60% increased damage against immobilized enemies, which is actually really powerful. There's also like critical hit chance against immobilized enemies, increased damage against immobilized enemies, immobilization buildup, which applies to any immobilized, which as you look at it, it specifically states frozen, pinned, heavy stunned, and electrocuted. And then, of course, you can get buildup for different things. Like magnitude for something is good, right? So if you look at like bleeding magnitude, you can get 10% increased bleeding magnitude you inflict, right? But the thing is that increasing your physical damage, which is what is applying the bleeding, is also a good way to increase the bleed magnitude. It's kind of an odd catch-22 in a lot of situations in that magnitude is not as good as increasing the base in most situations. Now, if you can get magnitude and damage at the same time, like for instance, this one over here gives you 5% damage as extra cold, and it gives you 20% freeze buildup. 20% is a good number. Why is 20% a good number? Because when you look at cold nodes, like for instance, cold damage nodes, they're only 10%. Right? So in this particular case, a 20% increase to your freeze buildup is going to be 10% more than the damage that you would get. But you are losing that 10% damage in the process. You have to like think about that a little bit. Negative resistance or penetration, like for instance, penetrates 15% cold resistance, is also a way that you increase your immobilization, because being able to reduce the resistance of the monster, as we talked about earlier, is going to increase the damage that you deal, and it's going to help your immobilization. There's also things like this, which will increase the magnitude. Like for instance, magnitude of the shock you inflict is going to increase the damage that the monster takes. You can also increase the chill duration, shock duration, and so forth and so on. The duration of a freeze is nice because you can, of course, make the monster freeze for longer. And when you have things like this that give you 60% increased damage against immobilized enemies, that's pretty massive. You can actually get this bonus yourself if you're using this passive right here, Inspiring Ally, which applies all increases and reductions to companion damage, also apply to you. So you can get that 60% bonus as well. And then, you know, you have like your fire damage bonuses, your extra damage as fire, your extra damage as cold, your extra damage as lightning, and so forth and so on. Shocking is really good because shocking, of course, when you shock a target, it increases the damage that the target takes. It's actually really good. If you look at shock, it specifically states shock is an ailment that causes targets to take 20% increased damage and lasts for 4 seconds on players and 8 seconds on non-players by default. This means that shocking a target is beneficial to what? We talked about this earlier, which is scaling your damage is the best way to apply any ailment, bar none. And yes, shocking the target will help all of the ailments, not just one, not just the lightning one. Being able to shock the target, adding in a shock of some type, even if it's shocked ground or some type of shocking that you're applying yourself, or if you have your minion shocking, you're adding 20% damage. They're taking 20% more damage than they would normally, which means that your freeze is 20% more effective. Your poison is 20% more damage. Your bleed is doing 20% more damage, etc., 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 right? So being able to shock the target is just another way that you can potentially increase your overall damage output and also increase your freezing. Now, there are some support gems that can help you with your freezing effects, right? So if you have some specific support gems, let's take a look at some support gems real quick. And we're going to take a look at things like freeze, which is 50% more freeze buildup. This is a multiplier, and it's actually really good once you actually have your character set up properly. So if you have a large amount of cold damage and you utilize this, it will help you get a large amount of more freeze buildup, right? Because it's going to multiply your freeze buildup and make it better for you to freeze targets. If you're struggling with freezing targets, I'd highly recommend that you try out freeze, because it does actually help out a lot. But you do need to fix your damage problems first before you start using it. I wouldn't use, if you're already struggling for damage, I wouldn't use this. You probably want to just use something that's going to increase your overall damage instead. Unifying your damage sources can be helpful as well. So something like Embitter, which is actually really good. This one basically makes it so that you have the ability to take all of your gain as and turn it into a single type of gain as. So if you have gain as fire, gain as lightning, gain as cold, gain as chaos, gain as physical, all of those gain as become gain as cold, right? And as we know with all ailment types, the more damage you do of the specific ailment type that is causing that specific ailment, the better that ailment works, right? So unifying all your extra damage as cold is going to give you a massive amount of cold damage, which is of course going to help you freeze targets better. When you put it onto something, for instance, that is not doing cold damage, like for instance, I'm trying to think if this character is the right character to show this on. I don't really think that it is. Let's take a look at this one real quick. So let's use this one as an example, right? So I have this particular weapon for my shields. And it has gain as 5% of extra damage as all elements. And I also have gain 15% of damage as extra cold. If you take a look at my shield ability, my shield wall ability currently has no Embitter, right? So I'm doing physical. You can see the breakdown here. I've got physical, I've got fire, I've got cold, and I've got lightning. So I've got a gain as of all of the above. I've got 36,765 lightning. Well, if I take this and I utilize an Embitter gem in this particular place, and we're going to use Embitter, and I throw Embitter in here, what you will see is that Embitter converts itself and takes my damage types and unifies them. So I start to get less fire and less lightning damage, right? Because those were gain as numbers. And you can see my cold damage goes up to 56,260. So I'm basically converting all of my gain ases together into a specific element, which is helpful if I'm trying to freeze things. Obviously, all damage that you do is going to contribute to your freeze, but in general, like, your main ability that does the most damage is going to be the thing that really freezes targets. One of the best freezing abilities in the game, by the way, in my personal opinion, is Lunar Assault. Lunar Assault's kind of crazy. It has a massive amount of freezing potential. It has huge more multipliers on its freezing, and it hits like pretty much everything on the screen too, which is kind of crazy. If you're really looking for like the best freezing ability in the game, I think Lunar Assault is probably it. It converts 80% of physical damage to cold, and it has 646% more freeze buildup, which is just insane. And then on top of that, it also gains 10% of physical damage as cold, so you get more cold damage with that ability as well. Just overall, just absolutely crazy for freezing targets. And when you're in a pack and you're actually utilizing it, and you literally see like the entire pack just freezes almost instantaneously as soon as you swipe your hands, it's kind of nutty. There was the primed for freeze there for a second. Hold on. Let me see if I can show that off again. I'll try to be more precise with my swings. There you go. You see the little icicle above their head? That is the primed for freeze. So if I were to use Arctic Howl at this particular point, they would freeze instantaneously. Primed for is actually a pretty good mechanic. What else can we talk about when it comes to immobilizations, freezes, etc.? I know I talked about scaling your damage, but bigger is always better, right? Bigger, giggity, is always better. And this goes for pretty much everything, right? If you're trying to freeze, if you're trying to ignite, if you're trying to bleed, poison, whatever, most of the time, and there are exceptions to this, like there are items that will allow you to have like 2 poison stacks, or there are items that will allow you to have more, of a particular dot on a target. But for the most part, whenever you're trying to apply an ailment to a target, The biggest hit is the one that matters. It doesn't add up all your small hits, really, like when you're putting a bleed on a target. And the same thing kind of goes for your freezes too, is that yes, it does kind of add up your smaller hits into the number, but being able to hit a target and freeze it instantaneously is much better than hitting a target like 7 or 8 times and then the target finally freezing on like the 8th hit, right? And when it comes to damage over time, it's very important because you can only have one dot, right? So with like ignites, bleeds, and poisons, unless you are specifically scaling the number, which you can scale the number. There are ways to do it. There's a spear that gives you like infinite poisons. There's a couple like different items like the snake bite that give you like +1 poison applied per target or something. There are some ways, but for the most part, when you apply that ignite, bleed, or poison, you want it to be applied by your highest hitting damage ability, not a really low damage ability, unless you're only utilizing it for like, like to pull it or something. Like if you're just applying the ignite to pull it later with something else, like consumes the ignite that gives you additional damage, or consumes the poison or the bleed to give you an additional damage, like that's okay, I guess, in most respects. But if you want actual damage out of it, you want the bleed or ignite or whatever to be applied by your highest damage ability. And the same kind of goes for like your freezes, is that your freezes are going to be applied by the highest damage ability that you have, or the one that multiplies your freeze buildup by the most. But even in the situation where you're multiplying your freeze buildup, like with Lunar Assault, you still want Lunar Assault to do damage, because if it's not doing damage, you're not going to get much freeze out of it, right? So you still want things, like the ability to increase your overall damage type. In fact, I should probably set up more multipliers on here. Yeah, no, mine is probably not set up as efficiently as it could be for freezing targets specifically, but I'm kind of lazy with Lunar Assault because Lunar Assault has such a massive multiplier that it makes it very easy to freeze targets even with lower damage, specifically because of how good the multiplier is on this specific skill. It's kind of unique in that way because there's a lot of abilities in the game that have these bonuses, but Lunar Assault is really the main one that just kind of like ignores most of the conventions when it comes to like freezing targets. It's designed to freeze targets, and that's what it does, and it's very good at freezing targets. Another thing that you need to be aware of is that you're not utilizing something that's going to sabotage you, okay? So we're going to talk about this. This is a whole new section, is don't sabotage yourself, right? There are ways that you can potentially sabotage yourself with freezing and chilling and ignite and all these other things, okay? First off, be aware that some abilities are not capable of freezing. Shred, for instance, specifically states in the ability, cannot cause freeze buildup. Right here. It is written right here. So Shred, no matter what you do, no matter how much cold damage it has, no matter how well you build it, no matter if you put a freeze rune in there or not, it cannot cause freeze buildup because it is specifically restricted from doing so. Other ways that you can potentially sabotage yourself is using support gems that destroy your ability to freeze or ignite or whatever targets. There are a lot of support gems in the game that can prevent you from being able to do that in a very myriad of ways. Like, for instance, if I type in freeze, you will find an ability known as Frostfire. Frostfire makes it so that supported skills cannot cause freeze buildup right there. So if you use Frostfire in an ability, it will not cause freeze buildup ever again. Another way that you can potentially do this is through support gems like Brutality. Brutality will convert all of that damage into physical damage. It says supported skills deal 30% more physical damage, but you get no chaos and no elemental damage at all, right? So if you're trying to freeze a target, if you're trying to ignite a target, if you're trying to shock a target, you can't do any of that because Brutality will take all that damage away. And so if you're no longer doing the damage type required to apply that ailment, then you're not going to get any ailment, right? So there are ways that you can potentially like sabotage yourself into like, oh, why am I not freezing anything? And You might be using Brutality, or you might be using one of the things that prevents you from freezing the target, or you could be using an ability like Shred, which is just by default prevented from freezing targets. And you have to be careful about that in those ways. Now, bosses. So let's talk about bosses for a second. So freezing or ailments on bosses. So why are bosses so hard to apply ailments to? This is because, number one, they have large HP pools. Most of what happens with ailments is because of the hit points of the monster, right? Think about it like a percentage-based scenario. Kind of similar to if you played Diablo 2 and you know about faster hit recovery stuns. Faster hit recovery stuns are based on the amount of HP that the monster has, or that you have, and how much damage is dealt relative to your HP pool. And this is the same for you as well in this game, is that the ailments are applied to you based on how much hit points you have, and then those hit points are then multiplied by, like stun threshold or freeze threshold increases, right? So because bosses have such large hit point pools, they tend to have much higher resistance to being shocked, to being frozen, to being, like bled and things like that. It's just in general going to be more difficult because they have more mitigations, they have more health, etc., right? For bleeds, for poisons, and for ignites, the mitigations are more important in this situation because obviously a boss has higher mitigations, and those mitigations are going to lower the amount of damage that you're doing, and by lowering the amount of damage that you're doing, you're going to obviously apply less of a dot to the target. For the immobilizations like freeze and stun and pin and whatnot and electrocution, those are also having the same issue, but they're also compounding on another issue, which is the boss has freeze threshold, and that freeze threshold is based on his very large hit point pool, which is another problem. So we can put in problem number 2, higher mitigations, and then of course problem number 3 is that they don't die quickly. And this goes back to our original problem, which is the more damage you do, the easier it is to freeze a target, right? So it's the same thing with a boss. The more damage you do to the boss, the easier it is to freeze them. And the more damage you do to a boss, the quicker they die, right? So if the boss isn't dying quickly, then your damage isn't high enough, essentially. You're having an issue with your damage output. And that's just the way that the cookie crumbles on this. The way that mitigations work in this game, especially armor. So let's talk specifically about armor. So armor mitigations, specifically hate small hits. Right? So the whole thing about armor is it's very good at mitigating small damage, but not so good at mitigating high damage. Obviously, if you're dealing with a situation where you're trying to stun a target, armor breaking them is very important, right? So armor break not only increases damage, but also strips armor, which basically takes away their mitigation, which is absolutely huge for armor, right? And that's the same exact thing that you want to do with your cold, your fire, your lightning, is you want to strip their resistances, and then you also want to get more damage by applying exposure, right? So these are pretty simple steps, but it's things that you have to take if you're trying to optimize your specific ailments, whatever that ailment is. Now, flammability, ignite and flammability, they added a new thing with ignite. This was in like one of the most recent patches, like I think it was like 0.4 or something, or maybe it was like 0.35 or something. I can't remember. They started adding flammability. So flammability is here. And flammability is a debuff that provides a chance for hits to ignite a target. It is not itself an ailment, but is closely associated with ignite. which is fire damage from hits contributes to the magnitude of the flammability, so the hits deal more fire damage, will ignite more often. The base magnitude of flammability is 1% chance to ignite the target for every 5% of the target's ailment. The threshold is dealt as fire damage, and flammability from a hit is applied before the hits to the blah, blah, blah. So basically, the way that flammability works is the higher the flammability goes, the more likely it is that the target will be ignited. And this is something that you may have to pay attention to. But from what I understand, the higher damage your fire damage is, the more flammability that you apply. And if you get to 100%, as it says down here, it says multiple instances of flammability stack, raising the chance for hits to ignite to the target to up to 100%. Which basically means that if you hit a target with a big enough hit, it's 100% flammability, and then the target is instantly ignited, right? So keep that in mind. Trying to think if there's anything else I've left out of these. We've gone over a lot, but it's really not a lot. Like, the one thing that I really need you to take away from this is it's not that difficult to build a character that can freeze or, you know, bleed or ignite or pin or poison or shock or electrocute, whatever it is that you're trying to do. It is not difficult to create that to happen. All you really have to do is just build a character that has that specific damage type. You build a character that has cold, or you build a character that has fire, or you build a character that has lightning, right? And the crazy thing is a lot of people will go with physical damage weapons, right? But you don't need to go with a physical damage weapon. If you're trying to freeze things, a very good weapon type that you could potentially utilize is a cold damage weapon. Like, for instance, my current weapon is all cold. It is a massive cold damage weapon that only does cold damage. It has a little tiny bit of physical damage, but for the most part, it's cold. And it multiplies my damage better that way because I'm not relying entirely on that specific modifier, right? So in this particular case, I'm getting a massive amount of cold damage through those modifiers. You can look at my weapon. This is my main weapon right here. My main weapon is 203 to 305 cold damage. It has a really nice increased elemental damage with attacks, T1 cold and a T4 cold, attack speed, plus 5 melee skills. It's a very nice weapon. And it gives me a pretty massive amount of DPS, right? So, like, I can get my DPS crazy high because I'm attacking so quickly, but Shred can't, of course, freeze targets, so I have to rely on Lunar Assault to do that specifically. So when I'm working on my combos, I can't just go in and attack with Shred. I need to... Ooh, don't want to activate that just yet. I have to freeze them first. And once they are frozen, then I can shred them and I can cause all my nice little explosions. Which Shred, of course, relies on me freezing the targets. Hopefully this has helped you guys out. If you have any questions about specific things, I know this is a more broad generalization, and I'm not talking about, like, you know, specific things in general. The only thing I really did leave out was Electrocution. Electrocution does require a specific skill or a specific support gem to activate. It is based on, like, lightning damage, but there's always exceptions to the rules. Like, you can freeze with other effects. If you look at the 3 Dragons helmet, for an example, the 3 Dragons helmet allows you to basically use other damage types to apply ailments, right? So, like, in this particular case, fire damage from hits is now shocking. Cold damage from hits is now fire, and lightning damage from hits is now freeze. So if you're utilizing the 3 Dragons helmet, you can utilize lightning damage to freeze targets. Or you can utilize fire damage to shock targets, and so forth and so on, which is essentially a way that you can bypass the normal restrictions of always having to do cold damage to freeze the target or always having to do fire damage to ignite. And that is just it's a complicated, like, web of items that can allow you to get various effects that you're looking for. But the meat and potatoes of everything just really comes down to damage. The more damage you do, the better your freezing becomes. The more you reduce their resistances, the better the freezing works. The more that you increase the damage that the monster is taking. the better the freeze works. The more that you like strip their armor, or in general just make it much better for them to take damage from various effects. It's always going to come down to damage if you're concerned about trying to apply the largest, best form of ailment that you can. As always, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe button if you enjoy the content, and keep watching.